and welcome to my channel. And in continuation with the exam ready series, this time it's about the communicable disease etymology. And this we will be taking it up in two parts. And here we go with the part one. There are a lot of long questions that comes from this area with the applied aspect of it, giving you a clinical scenario or asking some questions specific to the communicable diseases, and you have to answer accordingly. There may be, as in this first question, given a clinical scenario, and you may be asked the diagnosis, the case management and preventive measures as per the national programs, or you may be simply asked about the different communicable disease national programs and their strategies and setbacks and things like that. So begin with the first one. Well, the question says a 7-day-old baby is brought to you with excessive cry, refusal of feed and convulsions. Discuss the diagnosis, case management and preventive measures as per the National Immunization Program. Well, this question has been a requested one from my students, so here it goes. But as for this particular scenario, let's see how we come to the diagnosis. Firstly, a diagnosis is first done based on the certain criteria. So we have to classify. Here, given scenario, a suspected case is any neonate who could suck and cry normally during the first 2 days of life and developed tetanus-like illness or death between 3 and 28 days of age. And who is a confirmed case? Normal ability to suck and cry during the first 2 days of life and could not suck normally between 3 and 28 days of age and developed muscle stiffness and spasm or jerking. Here we get to see that many of the symptoms matches with the confirmed case. That is, there has been refusal of feed, that is not sucking at all. There has been convulsions matching with the muscle stiffness or spasms and jerkings. And there has been excessive cry. So we can say this matches the confirmed case of neonatal tetanus. Coming to the case management, you have to follow the dictum, that is assess. That is, all sick children are to be assessed for the A, B, C and D's. What are those? The airway, breathing, circulation, coma, convulsions and severe dehydration. All these are to be assessed for. Next, look, listen and feel. What do you look, listen and feel for? That is, check the blood sugar for hypoglycemia, maintain the temperature, keeping the infant dry and well wrapped, that is, preventing hypothermia, and check the young infant's immunization status to see if it is fit or not. So once you have assessed, looked, listened and felt, the next is identifying and initiating the proper treatment. As you all know, neonatal tetanus is a medical emergency that requires hospitalization. You have to go for human tetanus immunoglobulin or equine-derived antitoxin tetanus serum or intravenous immunoglobulin, whichever is available at that spot. Anticonvulsants are to be given, and in this case, the preferred one is the benzodiazepines. Antibiotics are also to be started, and the preferred is the metronidazole or penicillin G. Supportive care, that is keeping the patient in a dark and quiet environment to reduce the risk of reflex spasms. Nasogastric feeding for newborn infants. If muscle spasms are occurring, it is critical to maintain a safe airway. And of course, if mechanical ventilation is not available, patient should be carefully monitored in order to minimize the spasm and autonomic dysfunction while avoiding the respiratory failure. So what are the preventive measures based on the National Immunization Program? Firstly, increase and sustain the high coverage level with 2 doses of booster dose of tetanus toxoid. Increase the proportion of institutional delivery. Increase the delivery by trained health personnel. Strengthen the surveillance system. Health education and behavioral change communication. And training of concerned health workers. So you have seen that, how precisely I have dealt with the whole question, but without leaving behind any important points. So focus on those areas. Now coming to a very important question. Enumerate the important parameters used for measuring malaria problem in your community. What are the causes of setback of malaria in your country? Describe in brief the strategies followed under National Malaria Eradication Program. Well, the important parameters used for measuring malaria problem can be divided into the pre-eradication era and the eradication era parameters. In the pre-eradication area, the child's plain rate in 2 to 10-year-old children to measure the prevalence of malaria is used, and when it is less than 10%, it is called hypoendemic. It is 11 to 15%, it's called mesoendemic. When it is 51 to 75%, it is called hyperendemic, and when it is more than 75%, it is called holoendemic. Another parameter is the child parasite rate, that is the percentage of children 2 to 10 years who are positive for malarial parasite in their blood smears. The other one is the infant parasite rate. It is the percentage of infant positive for malarial parasite in blood smears. It is in fact the most sensitive indicator signifying active transmission of malaria in the community. When it is 0, that is IPR is 0 for 3 consecutive years, it suggests absence of any kind of malarial transmission. So what are the indicators of the eradication era? In the eradication era, again, the most important one is the API, that is the annual parasite incidence. The number of confirmed new cases for malaria registered in a specific year expressed per 1,000 individuals under surveillance for a given country, territory or geographic area. Annual blood examination rate is another parameter. It is calculated as the number of slides examined per population multiplied by 100. It is an index of the operational efficiency of the program. Another indicator used in this regard is the slide positivity rate, or SPR, which is defined as the number of laboratory confirmed malaria cases per 100 suspected cases examined, and it provides an alternative method for estimating the temporal changes in the malaria incidence. SPR of 5% we have to spray on priority basis. Another important indicator used in the eradication area is the slide falciparum rate, that is the percentage of slides positive for Plasmodium falciparum parasites. Coming to the second part of the question, that is causes of setback in malaria eradication. Setbacks in malaria eradication occurred in the 60s and 70s and led to a malaria resurgence. If you look at the figures of 1961, it was 50,000 only, while in 1976 it rose to 6.4 million. So this was all owing to certain problems which we will group it under technical, administrative and operational ones. The technical factors were resistance of mosquito vectors to insecticides, other malarial parasites developing resistance to chloroquine due to mutation. In the administrative factors, the contributing ones were shortage of insecticides and antimalarial drugs, increased operational costs, labor shortage, division of funds, dependence on multipurpose worker and basic health services, lack of commitment at the national level because they had already become very complacent with the control. In the operational factors was the application of eradication measures without considering the epidemiological parameters completely, inadequate surveillance, inadequate coverage of residual insecticides, and premature takeoff to consolidation and maintenance phase. Let's have a SWOT analysis of the malarial control program. That is the strength, weakness, opportunity and threats. of this malarial control program, which dates back to 1953. Well, that itself was its strength because it had a long experience since its inception in 1953. It began with a very strong political commitment. The surveillance was covering all the blocks. The ASHAs were being utilized in all endemic villages for surveillance. The rapid diagnostic test for diagnosis of Plasmodium falciparum introduced. The microscopy available up to the primary health center level. ACT, that is artemisinin based combination therapy for treatment of Plasmodium falciparum introduced, which was very effective. LLINs introduced, that is the long-lasting insecticide-treated nets, which were found to be very useful. And there was research support from NIMR. That's the National Institute for Malarial Research. Regarding the weakness, the rapid diagnostic test coverage needed to be expanded to all endemic villages. And there was delay in conducting the microscopic examination of smears. And ACT, that is artemisinin-based combination therapy, needed to be used for all PF cases in the country. Requirement of total shift from re-impregnation of plain nets to LLINs. Difficulty in distribution of the ITNs, that is the insecticide-treated bed nets, in remote areas with inhibited access. Deficiency of human resources at all levels, from national to the block level. So what were the opportunities? Well, NRHM strengthening the health structure and malarial control at all levels as the umbrella program. NURM expected to be launched in 12th five-year plan that would have strengthened the urban malarian scheme. Increasing the commitment for funds from the international agencies such as GFATM. And the NGOs willing to be the partners. And possibility of introduction of pan-specific rapid diagnostics tests for both PF and PV, that is falciparum and vivax malarial parasites. And what were the threats? Overloading of the ASHAs with too many programs. They were expected to do too many things along with the malarial control. Development of insecticide resistance, development of spread out drug resistance, social and ecological constraints to effectiveness of standard interventions in some high-risk population, and social unrest in some areas. So this was the total matrix of the malaria control program. And here are some important trivia regarding this program. As India is the only high endemic country which has reported a decline of 17.6% in 2019 as compared to 2018. The annual parasite incidence, that is API, reduced by 27.6% in 2018 compared to 17 and 18.4% in 2019 compared to 2018. So India has sustained API less than 1 since year 2012. India has also contributed to the largest drop in cases region-wide, from approximately 20 million cases to 6 million. The percentage drop in the malaria case was 71.8% and deaths was 73.9% between 2000 and 2019. India has achieved a reduction of 83.34% in the malarial morbidity and 92% in malarial mortality between the year 2000 and 2019, and thereby has achieved the goal 6 of the Millennium Development Goal, that is 50 to 75% decrease in case incidence between 2000 and 2019. Besides, World Health Organization has initiated the High Burden to High Impact Initiative, that is HBHI initiative, in 11 high malaria burden countries including India. Implementation of the High Burden to High Impact initiative has been started in 4 states, that is West Bengal, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh in July 2019. A key strategy to reignite the progress is the High Burden High Impact response, catalyzed in 2018 by World Health Organization and RBM partnership to end malaria, continued to make impressive gains in India with 18% reduction in cases and 20% reduction in deaths over the last 2 years since its inception. Now coming to a applied question from this area. That is, you may be asked, analyze a clinical scenario and accordingly manage it. Like this one. Worker returns from his area of work and presented at clinic 2 weeks later with fever and chills for 2 days. Diagnose, treat and prevent measures with special reference to place of posting. Okay. So this, with its fever and chill and its history of project visit, is suggested of a clinically suspected malarial case. The rapid diagnostic test for dual antigen for malarial parasite and microscopic thick smear examination to be undertaken. If it's positive for Vivax, you have to treat for chloroquine for 3 days along with primaquine 0.25 mg per kg body weight daily for 14 days. If positive for falciparum, then in northeastern states, treatment with age-specific artemisinin-based combined therapy for 3 days plus primaquine single dose on second day. In other states, age-specific ACT-SP, that is artemisinin-based combination therapy, that is artesunate, sulfadoxine and pyrimethamine for 3 days and primaquine single dose on second day. If it is positive for a mixed infection in northeastern states, the treatment is age-specific ACT-AL, that is artemisinin-based combination therapy combination of artemether and lumefantrine for 3 days and primaquine daily dose for 14 days. In other states, treatment with specific age-wise ACT-SP for 3 days and primaquine daily dose for 14 days. If it is negative, no antimalarial treatment to be given. Treatment as per clinical diagnosis and further investigation. And regarding the general treatment, avoid treatment in empty stomach. First dose under observation and 2 repeated vomiting occurs within the 30 minutes. And corticosteroids certainly not to be used. Regarding the preventive measures, use of personal protective measures like ITNs and LLINs, that is the insecticide-treated bed nets, or the LLINs which I have mentioned earlier. Indoor residual spray, anti-larval measures to prevent the vector breeding, chemoprophylaxis to vulnerable populations like migrant laborers, army personnel traveling to high PF endemic cases areas. That's why when they mention that, with focus on the area of travel or project or work area, means that that's a clue to the fact that they are a vulnerable population because of their movement. In case of short-term chemoprophylaxis, there's up to 6 weeks stay. Doxycycline 100 mg once daily in adults and 1.5 mg per kg body weight for children above 8 years to start 2 days before travel and continued for 4 weeks after leaving the endemic area. In the long term, that is more than 6 weeks, mefloquine 250 mg once weekly to start 2 weeks before travel and 4 weeks after leaving the endemic area. So that was something about malaria, its details, certain programmatic aspects, as well as applied question. Now coming to another clinical scenario of communicable disease. A 25-year-old man reported in the outdoor with high fever, chills and retroorbital pain. Outline the diagnosis, case management, community interventions as per the national guidelines. Well, again we'll begin with the diagnosis, and that too in a similar fashion, classifying it based on criteria. Here we say that the probable case is 1, where probable dengue, live in, travel to dengue endemic area history, fever, or two of the following criteria. There is nausea, vomiting, rash, aches and pains, tunicate test positive, leukopenia, any warning sign. So based on this probable cases and on the basis of evaluation of the history, physical examination and clinically, this matches as a case of dengue fever. And how will you go for the management? Well, recognizing the febrile patient could have dengue, notifying early to the public health authorities that is the patient is a suspected case of dengue, managing patients in the early febrile phase of dengue, recognizing early stage of plasma leakage or critical phase and initiating fluid therapy, recognizing the patients with warning signs who need to be referred for admission and or intravenous fluid therapy to a secondary healthcare facility. And the physical examination should include assessment of the mental state, assessment of the hydration status, assessment of its hemodynamic status of the person, checking for the tachypnea, acidotic breathing, pleural effusion if any, checking for the abdominal tenderness, hepatomegaly, ascites, examination for rash, bleeding manifestation, and of course carrying out the tourniquet. The mentioned patient apparently belongs to group A dengue patient who may be sent home. These are patients actually who are able to tolerate the adequate volumes of oral fluids and pass urine at least once in every 6 hours and do not have any of the warning signs, particularly when fever subsides. Review daily for disease progression, decreasing white blood cell count, defervescence, and warning signs. Encourage the oral intake of oral rehydration solution, fruit juice, and other fluid. Encourage oral fluids. Give paracetamol for high fever if the patient is uncomfortable. Tapered sponge. Do not give acetyl salicylic acid, that is aspirin group of drugs, ibuprofen, or other non-steroidal and anti-inflammatory agents. Caregivers should bring the patients to hospital immediately if any of the following signs occurs. There is no clinical improvement, deterioration around the time of defervescence, severe abdominal pain, persistent vomiting, cold and clammy extremities, lethargy or irritability and restlessness, and bleeding. In that case, if such things happen, then it has to be managed as a case of group B. And then the management would entail obtaining a reference hematocrit before fluid therapy, give only isotonic solutions such as 0.9% saline, Ringer's lactate, or Hartmann solution. Start with 5 to 7 ml per kg per hour for 1 to 2 hours, then reduce to 3 to 5 milliliter per kg per hour for 2 to 4 hours, and then reduce to 2 to 3 milliliter per kg per hour or less according to the clinical response. And we have to reassess the clinical status and repeat the hematocrit. If the hematocrit remains the same or rises only minimally, continue with the same rate for another 2 to 4 hours. If the vital signs are worsening and hematocrit is rapidly rising, increase the rate to 5 to 10 ml per kg per hour for the next 1 or 2 hours. And we have to reassess the clinical status, repeat the hematocrit, and review the fluid infusion accordingly. Give the minimum intravenous fluid volume required to maintain good perfusion and urine output of about 0.5 ml per kg per hour, and intravenous fluids are usually needed for only 24 to 48 hours. Patients with warning signs should be monitored by healthcare providers until the period of risk is over. So now let's look at the community interventions as per the national guidelines. Well, presently, the dengue program is under the Integrated Vector Management Strategy along with supportive management based on NVBD-CP. And the key elements include advocacy, social mobilization, and legislation. Promotion and embedding of IVM principles, that is integrated vector management principles, in the design of policies in all relevant agencies, organizations, and civil society, establishment or strengthening of public health laws and regulations, and empowerment of the communities. Use of WHO's Communication for Behavioral Impact, that's COMBI, which is a planning tool for social mobilization and communication activities. Integrated approach, that is rational use of available resources through the integration of non-chemical and chemical vector control methods and other disease control methods to treat several diseases. Public-private partnership or PPP and intersectoral convergence at all levels. Evidence-based decision making, adaptation of strategies and intervention to local ecology, epidemiology and resources guided by operational research. along with capacity building, provision of essential material infrastructure, financial resources, and human resources at the national and local levels to manage IVM strategies on the basis of a situational analysis. Well, this was part 1 of the communicable disease epidemiology questions. Hope you like it. Do share and subscribe if you have not till now, and subscription is completely free. And in the comment box, please let me know if you have any specific queries. So, thank you for now. Happy studying.